You're listening to Design Systems Beyond the Button, where we dive into everything related to design systems for everyone from newbies to seasoned practitioners. I'm Neff, Product Marketing Manager at zeroheight, and I'm excited to use this podcast to get my burning design systems questions answered. I'm joined by my who has seen and experienced so much around.
And I'm Michelle. I'm looking forward to sharing tips, tricks, and experiences based on what I've done, but also from what I've seen from other design system teams. There's not much being publicly said because design systems can be so personal to a company. So, this might be a great way to share insight, and that way you can create your bestest design system ever.
All right, so today's topic is all about collaborating around a design system. And we picked this one because when you have a really great design system, it includes lots and lots of folks. At bare minimum, you probably have product designers and you have product engineers, but really great design systems also have folks like content designers and user researchers and perhaps even product managers. And when you involve so many different people and so many different disciplines, you've got to find a good way to collaborate. So, before we get too far into it, when I think about collaboration in a design system, I also think about this word that we throw around quite a bit, governance. And what is governance and what is collaboration when it relates to design systems?
Yeah, I think that is it's a good question because I think also governance has like a I don't know, people don't really like that word, right? Like it just seems like a dirty word. But I think of collaboration as like the actual like verb of like working together
Mm,
and yeah, towards shared outcomes. So the actual verb of that and I think governance, like a lot of times people will think of governance as like rules and you must do this or else, but like governance is really I think of as just it's like understanding and like kind of I guess it's the process, right? The
mm.
process of collaborating together. Like what's the process look like? What's step one, what's step two, who's participating in step three? Like it's the outlining of the process. So not so much the rules. There are kind of like guidelines and rules to it, but it's not like, just the rules. It's just understanding how the collaboration works, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. So, in that lens, is it possible to have collaboration without governance, or do you have to establish governance first in order for collaboration to happen?
Yeah, I think so. Generally when we work together, like collaboration, it can be informal where it's like, hey,
Mm,
like Neff, let's get together and brainstorm. But governance is the process of, okay, brainstorming. We know what we're going to do and we know kind of the guidelines of engaging in brainstorming. Okay, no bad ideas. Let's write down, jot down ideas and then narrow them down or something like that. So there is some governance, just not as spoken. I think with design systems, because you can work with so many people and so many people might have feedback, especially if you work at a large company. That's where governance is definitely more necessary. And everyone needs to have that shared understanding of what the process is. So you can collaborate on small things, but there is some like unspoken governance. But like when you're kind of scaling it to a design system where there's a lot of people involved and things can get easily confusing, then you probably need some level of governance.
yeah, totally. And let's talk about that scaling part of it, right? Like it almost feels a little bit like, to your point, if you're in a small company or perhaps you're in a design system that is very much in the nascent stage, you probably can get away with a lot of informal collaboration that has no real governance around it. But then as things get bigger and bigger and the design system becomes more important and it involves more people, then you want to sort of set those parameters. So, can you kind of talk a little bit about the stages of collaboration, right? So, if I say, hey, I want to start a design system at my enterprise company, what does collaboration look like in the beginning? And how do I scale that as the design system scales itself?
Yeah, so I think you know, there's a couple schools of approaches of like let's kind of establish collaboration and governance right away because it's going to scale and get messy. But I think and I've done both. So I you can also just have a small group of people start working on it just to kind of get going and then create more governance and more collaboration and scaling that. Um, I think the thing that I've experienced is that, when you're starting out, especially if it's an enterprise company, maybe there's other like pockets of teams that are starting design systems, and that's perfectly fine. Um, but yeah, you can collaborate more easily because I think you're also making a lot of decisions at the same time. So kind of going through like a very formalized process can be, I know, very time consuming. And a lot of times people don't have time for that. So it's a lot of it just getting like the components made in the design tool as well as coded. And if they're already established, you probably don't need to have a whole decision making process around it. So it doesn't necessarily need like a process to follow,
Mm,
especially because so many things are changing. You might have someone designing the button, and then you might have someone, who is designing all like of the check boxes and the drop downs and the radio buttons and all sorts of stuff. Like people are doing multiple things at once. So um, a lot of times I've seen people just try to like knock those things out before getting to a more formalized process. And then I think it's like once you're kind of more in like you're situated with like the design file and the coded libraries are mostly there. Then deciding on some of the more nuanced components or specialized components that can lend itself very easily to having some sort of governance process, in terms of who gets to submit or who can submit, what's that submission process like, who gets to weigh in on, does this become a component in the design system or not, and then who else needs to provide feedback. Is that like the design director? Are there art directors? Is
mm.
brand involved? So all those other aspects, when you're thinking about a bigger company, is like which teams need to be involved, which products need to be involved, who else from the company needs to weigh in. And the answer could be like none of these people, or it could be some of these people, right? Like, so um I think that's the other thing is like collaboration. you know I think also people are really interested in participating in the design system. So everybody wants to collaborate, but they don't have to all collaborate the same way. So it doesn't mean, now when you're like, hey, I want to collaborate the design system, that you're all of a sudden like making Figma components. Maybe you're collaborating from a brand perspective or something, or you're
Mhm.
providing feedback. And that's where the governance like really helps out in terms of setting some guidelines. And once people have that shared understanding, it's easier for them to participate.
Yeah, totally. And I guess like let's sit there for a second in terms of how governance is able to facilitate this effective collaboration. What are the governance models that you've tried in your career that you feel like have lended themselves well to getting lots of people to be excited about collaboration? And perhaps if you have any non-examples of what governance has looked like and perhaps has squashed collaboration or made it a little bit less likely amongst those companies.
Yeah, I think so. I've been part of so at an enterprise company, I was part of a smaller product, and we had a design system, and that was for the most part like centralized. Like we had a couple people deciding.
Mhm.
Um, so that's like when you have a small group deciding and like sharing out information for everyone else to consume. And the other is a federated model where you have kind of like a council of people who are working on different products. So at the enterprise company, we were trying to scale to, or trying to create one unified design system. And there's like small pockets of design systems around. And so we gathered representatives from all of those products to be able to weigh in on components. They were also responsible for creating those components as well, both code and design. And so in this aspect, it's a federated system, so there's no, like, central governing body for the design system. It's just like a council of people making decisions, creating the pieces, and then sharing them out to their teams. Um, and then the other method is hybrid, where you have a centralized team and they're working with other people from other products to provide feedback. So it's like a little bit federated, it's a little centralized. But I think a centralized team is very easy to work with, but
Mhm.
they might not be able to see everything that's going on because they're not in it day to day. Um, which is why I think everyone kind of eventually lands on a hybrid model of some sort, because that way you can reach out to other people in like a more of like a council to get feedback from the overall products. But I think I've done the federated model, And like as much as I want everyone to weigh in because we're making one design system, the team gets really big. We had about 15 or 16 people.
Mm,
And it was through several different time zones. So like India, Europe, US, so and China. So like it wasn't like finding a time to meet was really difficult, but then also getting a lot of opinions from 16 people is a lot, right? To have to decide um on some things. So that can be really really challenging. And it's also really slow to get things done because it's like we had to be like rigorous and get people's feedback. Okay, is this going to work for your product? So I think that's kind of where things are a little get a little tricky with collaboration because then it's like the intention is there to get everyone's feedback and to really serve the broader community, but at the same time it was really taxing on all
mm.
of us because it's like why does it take so long to make a decision? um so yeah, I think through that we had to like figure out, okay, we don't have to have everyone's opinion, but like we just need a direction and we need to trust in some people to provide that direction for some things, not for every component. So it really just depended on what we were looking at.
So, if you're listening to this and you say, okay, there's no way we can have a federated model because it would be too much, we would move too slow. But we also do have multiple products that we want to be represented in the design system. How do you make a design system that is able to serve multiple products and brands while also centralizing ownership so that things can happen quickly?
Yeah, I think like if I were to go back and do things differently rather than have like a team of 16 people like really participate as like a pseudo centralized design system team making those components, I would have like a smaller, much smaller team to sort of serve as a centralized team. The only challenge I had is like I wasn't able to have like a fully staffed design system team. So they were
Mm.
all taking part of their, you know, work weeks to like 10% of their time was devoted to the design system. So I think that's also what made it hard is that like if I could just get 10%, like that was better than 0%. But I would have loved like some people 100%. So even if you can get some people dedicated for a couple sprints, maybe, or a couple like a quarter or so to work on the design system and then make sure that they're getting feedback from the other products and finding a way to build that into existing processes. So maybe if there's like a design review, um, the design team, you can share the component with the design system team to get feedback or share it with a couple leads, identify certain people to participate, and with the intent of ensuring that you have feedback from all around versus I don't know, making sure you got feedback from like every single designer because that's probably not necessary, right? Like getting a feedback from a lead and identifying those leads would be good enough. So trying to find a way that makes it work for your team's processes, the company's existing processes in a way that's not going to like seem like a slog.
For sure. And I think that you are talking about something that is a very fair point, right? Like some of us who are here and listening to this have core design system teams, and that kind of facilitates one way of thinking about collaborating around a design system. But the reality is that lots of folks also might have people who, to your point, are dedicating some of their time to the design system or are doing it for a couple of sprints or whatever that might look like. How do you establish effective collaboration when some of those core players might be changing sprint to sprint, quarter to quarter? And then also, how do you get people excited about collaboration when they're doing it on a small scale versus that being a very core tenet of their role at the company?
Yeah, no, those are all really good questions. I think I think everybody gets excited about the design system, especially if you don't have one or you're gonna like
Mm-hmm.
redo one. People want to participate. Um, but it's hard to then give 50 people like a design system role in participating. So I think part of it's like outlining, okay, how do people participate and what are the different ways people can participate? And participation doesn't mean building a component or coding it. It can just mean providing feedback or sharing out the information. So having those roles defined might be helpful in terms of like, yeah, we would love to have you participate. We would love for you to share out with the team every time we come up with a new component, or you can mention during design critiques that this new component is available, people can switch to it, that type of thing, and be really like an advocate, and that's like a good way to participate. Um, and I think the other aspect is just it can be hard to participate and when you're participating in a small capacity, and to be excited about that. So I think acknowledging and celebrating the people who do help you
Mm,
goes a long way. So while it might not be like, 50% of your job and you're just doing these little ad hoc things or maybe helping out 10% of the time, acknowledging, the people's contribution is super helpful. I think, from a manager's perspective, that gives people, it demonstrates, it kind of helps people like lead by example of like, look, this person has done an awesome job with, shepherding this component through into the product or what have you, or this person's created all of these components, or this person has found gaps where we can create new components, whatever that may be. That definitely does go a long way. Um, and can definitely keep people excited, keep people engaged with the design system. Because I think the other thing is like nobody wants to have a design system that is kind of in this like siloed little centralized unit and feels very top down of like you must do this or else. Like that's not really a great way to like make friends. But once people see a lot of people are engaged with it and other people outside of like maybe that little mini core team are participating and shepherding things, like that's also a really good way to get people excited about using the design system and feel like that they've been heard and that their products are represented.
for sure. I like the idea of thinking about design system adoption as making friends. I do think that there is quite a bit of that around it. As you were talking about celebrating folks, it reminded me of the design system over at Eventbrite, Marmalade. And if you go through their design system, which is actually public, and we'll throw it in the show notes, you'll see little notes at the bottom of some of the component pages that shout out folks who were a part of building that component who were not a part of the core design system team. So it's really cool. I would imagine if you're Susie who helped build the checkbox component, you're scrolling through the design system site and you're like, there's me. You can show your mother, your husband, whoever else might care about that collaboration. So I think that there are like small ways that are very minimal effort to be able to make someone's day. And I think as humans, that sort of acknowledgement, it warms your heart. You're like, okay, cool, I made the checkbox component and I want to get my name on another page, so I'm going to help out in another way and collaborate around the design system, and really make it a continued part of the work that I'm doing at the company.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the thing is like people want to participate, and I think a lot of times when things fall short and people get a little grumpy is that when teams don't have a plan, or design system leads or managers don't have a plan, and
Mm,
so when someone comes to them saying like I want to participate, and you're just like, okay, cool, I'll write your name down and I'll get back to you, and then you don't get back to them, like, and then they see that design system stuff is happening, it's like it's kind of like a crappy feeling, and so that's when people get, like, grumpy about it, and they're just like, "Oh, this people don't care about, the actual products and the people building them." So I think that's the thing is, like, you might not think you need to have a plan for how people participate, but you definitely should. And that's kind of, like, where you're starting to build a little bit of governance and
yeah.
understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I would imagine that having a process and a plan around collaboration is also helpful for the core design system team, right? Like it can be overwhelming if a bunch of people are coming at you and saying, hey, I want to build this component and I want to do this and I want to do that. And it's like, okay, how do I effectively manage all of those things to bring that into the design system? I know some teams have managed that with a simple Google form that is like, hey, if you want to add add a component to the design system, then fill out this information that gives us what we need to be able to put it onto the site. Or maybe it is some sort of barometer that tells you, hey, this is something that's worth adding to the design system site, or it's not. So it's been used this many times in Figma, or it is in the product this many times, therefore we should document it. But I would imagine that setting some sort of process around how people collaborate and what they might be able to bring to the table is amazing for that person because they know what to expect, but also gives that core team a way to manage all of these requests, which might be really, really high when we're talking about a larger enterprise company.
Yeah, for sure. And like I think that's the thing is like it's great as a way to kind of wrangle because there's a lot of wrangling, especially once you start to work and scale your design system. So you're like, let's get to one unified design system or figure out what that's like. It can get very overwhelming because I think a lot of times product teams will work in silos because they have their own priorities. So I think, what seems like a top priority to them might not actually be a top priority across the company. So that definitely helps with that. I think also having some sort of guidance and, guidelines around how people can participate is also helpful for the design team's managers. So
Mm,
I know that a lot of times, designers will go to their manager, I want to participate in the design system. And their design manager will be like, no, no, I need you on this product. I can't give you up to, because then the design manager starts to make assumptions as to like what that role is of like, oh, they're going to be spending all their time making components and I really need them to design features. When if you have like some sort of guidance of like, here's how people can participate. Um, that way the manager is like, oh, okay, you want to participate in the design system. Let's talk about the ways you can participate and
mm,
find a way that works well for the work that the product that the designer's on. So maybe they're not creating components, but they are reviewing or they're sharing,
sure.
new components. So I think it definitely goes both ways for sure.
Totally. We have a question in the chat from Christian. I think thus far we've been talking about what collaboration looks like, but Christian has a question around who can collaborate. And the question is, would you let product owners collaborate in design system files, even if they don't have design experience or any Figma skills at all?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think like I am like always gonna like propose that people collaborate with everyone early and often. And
Hmm.
how you might collaborate can really depend. And I think there's a couple of things. So they don't have any design experience, but they might have a good perspective to provide. So you wouldn't expect them to start creating Figma components, but you might just want their feedback. And so thinking about your process of like how does a component go from idea to actual production and implementation, where would the product owner like provide the most value in terms of contributing? um, and maybe they sit in and watch you all design and they just like to be informed. Maybe that's good enough. um, but yeah, the idea wouldn't be to like, okay, everyone, whoever is on the team that is interested in this product, like start making Figma components like that. That would not be very, that would be a nightmare to everyone, I think, even people who thought they wanted to participate. um so I think the idea is, yeah, trying to find a way to find a way that they can provide feedback and participate in a way that's suitable and valuable for everybody. If that makes sense. um
Yeah, I think it does. Blair over in the comments had a suggestion as well, that perhaps you can duplicate a file or even allow them to detach the component. I could see that going well in terms of placating them and giving them a place to play around in Figma where they won't mess up too much. But I suppose it could also go poorly. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how that might work out to have folks maybe have detached components, and then I suppose maybe bring them back together. What would that look like to you?
I think it's also it's kind of weird because it's like it depends on like what the product owner's motivations are. Like if they're trying to learn design on the side, maybe that's kind of a good way for them to tinker around. um but I think there's sometimes overstepping of boundaries can happen of like, I've designed it like this, why aren't you using it like this, right? And then it just
Mm,
becomes a contentious issue. And I think that's definitely something that you want to avoid. Like there's enough like drama with design systems that you don't need to like add more to it. Um, so I think like, figure out what's going to be helpful and not destructive in the long term.
Mm,
Um, and yeah, I think also like, and it can also go like different way, even if you have the skill set. So for example, design directors were probably individual contributors at some point doing design things. So they have a lot of opinions. Um, does that mean that they need to weigh in on like the line thickness around the border around the button? Probably not, but they can. And sometimes they feel compelled to, right? Because you're like, hey, we're making this component and wanted to get your feedback. And next thing you know, they're doing like a design critique and they're, think about director of design has other things to do. But
sure.
they can fall into that really easily. So starting to do design critique. And if that's not, I think if that's not what they need to be doing, like as a design manager or design system lead, like you need to help shepherd that conversation of like, hey, here's where we'll need your input. But other than
Mm,
that, you can trust the team because our designers are really talented and they've made these design decisions and realized, okay, we want the border of this button to be this thickness or what have you, right? So that way the design director isn't, coming in and redoing everything. um, so yeah, even if you have the skill set, like they can come in and you might not want them to. So like try to understand like the value that, that individual or that role can provide in the process.
yeah, totally. I think going back to the product owner example, I kind of think of perhaps what are the motivations for this person wanting to contribute to the design system? Is it that they don't agree with design decisions? And if that's the case, then it might be uh, a matter of making those like guidelines a little bit more clear and helping people understand why you've come to those particular design decisions. To your point, and how you would deal with the design director, or if we're talking about a product owner who feels like they have so much information to share based off of their research and they want to make sure that that makes it into the components and the patterns in a way that is meaningful, then perhaps it is about giving that person a space to be able to have user research be a part of the design system. But I suppose maybe there is something to that when we think about collaboration wholesale, right? Like there are some people who like want to collaborate around the design system, and absolutely we should welcome them with open arms. And there might be some instances in which we're saying like, hey, like we want you to collaborate, but perhaps what you're offering is born from a different problem, and let's actually solve that problem versus having you collaborate in the way that you are proposing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. I think there's, really getting down to that person's motivations and that maybe that role's motivations and understanding to see how you can mitigate some of that. So I think sometimes, they might have assumptions of like, oh, design isn't considering all of these things that I've talked to customers about or I'm aware of, or we have these features planned. Um, and maybe that's just it can be mitigated by inviting them to like a meeting where you're discussing components and
Mm,
just saying like, "Hey, like why don't you come sit in and see how we're talking about things, how we're discussing things." And that might be enough to be like, "Okay, I can trust this team." Because a lot of it comes down to being able to trust people and the team and even the process. So it could be a little bit of that. Um, I think sometimes depending on, if like a product owner for a product is like, we really want this to be a component, but it doesn't make sense for like the general like global design system at your company. Um, you can have a process for that saying like, okay, you can make that as a component for your product, but then if it does well and if other products need it, that's when we can elevate it to the main design system. It doesn't have to be in the main design system just yet, like, and that gives like a little bit of like flexibility where the product owner gets to have the component in with the feature that they need. They're not having to wait for it to be part of the design system. You don't have to incorporate in the design system immediately or
mhm,
veto it immediately. It just buys time because I think that's the other thing is like with design systems, it's all like there's a long play involved with it, and we talked about this in like the how we document first webinar where it's all about stability. Like you're creating stability for your product suite, your company. So you don't want to introduce too much too soon in a way that's sporadic. Like you want to introduce things in a way that's manageable, that can like endure like the years that the design system needs to be stood up for.
Yeah, that's a really good call out, right? Because I suppose that if you don't facilitate collaboration well, then it could lead to a disparate design system. And I think in like previous chats, we've talked about this need for people to trust in the design system, to be like, this is the source of truth that I want to follow. And I think in order to do that, they've got to believe that like it's stable, right? So I think that juxtaposition of how do we and also how do we allow for collaboration is one that we should continuously take a look at.
Yeah, yeah. And I think like, it doesn't have to be standing up this whole gigantic process from scratch of like, this is what the process is going to look like. And these are all like the steps. It's more about like, hey, like how do we decide and do things now? And how does that apply to uh how we need to design or decide for design systems? So that way you're not creating this whole new like way of doing things just for the sake of the design system, that you're kind of like following how people currently do things, which makes it easier for them to participate and adopt because it's something that they understand. And then just figuring out like where does it need to be different for the design system, so people understand like how things are different and why they're different because of how the design system has to scale across the products. That makes sense.
Sure, sure. And Blair has a question over in the chat around what happens after you do make a change. So I suppose in the context of this conversation, maybe somebody has said, "Hey, I want to build a component," and you're like, "Great idea. Why don't you build the component?" And now it's built and it's on the design system site. So Blair's question is, how do you communicate that update or change about the design system? Do you have a dedicated Slack channel? And what is just enough information for people?
Yeah, that's a super great question. So I think there's like a couple things almost at odds with each other. It's like people want to have like a single source of truth of
Mhm.
where what the information is, and you don't want to have to repeat yourself a lot, but also you have to repeat yourself a lot in terms of communicating updates, because people take in information and understand information in different ways. So, um, you know, you could have a dedicated Slack channel, and I know a lot of teams do have a dedicated Slack channel. And I actually think having a dedicated Slack channel that's like neutral, so you're not just reusing like a product design channel,
Mm,
because people who participate and use design systems are more than just product designers. There's engineers, PMs, other people, brand marketing. So having a dedicated Slack channel for announcements is really helpful. And then you can have a dedicated design system channel for questions as well. I wouldn't make just one because it gets really muddy, really confusing. Like you just want to have one way to disseminate the information. Um, but yeah, I think also like, making sure you have advocates within your other different teams, product teams, to say, hey, we have new components, or, joining a design critique or a design meeting, a team meeting, to say, hey, we have, you know, uh, these new updates. I think what you're going to have to do though is to ask if you can attend those meetings. So invite yourself, because people aren't going to think to invite you to the meetings. And no one's going to be like, no, we don't want you at these meetings. They'll be like, okay, yeah, we can give you a spot on the agenda. So it definitely can't hurt to ask. Yeah, I'm all about like, I don't know, forcing your way in, imposing yourself. As an introvert, I am advocating for this, and it works because like the worst they can say no, but whatever, like you'll just find another way. So I've done like team meetings, quarterly meetings, kickoffs. Also find out where engineers, what meetings they have. Sometimes we'll have a product kickoff like every quarter, so then
mm,
we would share information there. But then you would have to just repeat yourself. I think the other thing is like always pull them back toward like documentation of some sort. So like if you're using zero height, just say, here's the information on zero height. And so it's all in one place. It also gets them into the habit of going to the documentation to find anything that they need versus like asking random designer or random person, where can I find this? They'll know to go to the documentation first and foremost. So um, Yeah, I think that's the thing is like trying you have to repeat yourself to some extent, but try not to keep the information in several different places either. So like having that main information in your documentation is you know that single place, but prepare to share outwards. And the more you can automate this, I think the better, right? So you're not having to like do a bunch of things, or I guess delegate, right? So you're not having to go to every single meeting unless you're into that, which I don't think anyone is. Um,
Yeah, and I think to the other part of Blair's question, around how you're updating specific people, and what is just enough information for those folks. I think that that's like an interesting place to think about like automation, and to think about tailoring the message, right? Because like let's say you make an update and you just want the company to be tangentially aware. You might automate a message that goes to Slack that's just like, hey, by the way, the design system has some new colors, and we changed up this design token. And that's probably enough for like 95% of the company, right? But then you have like your engineers who are like, hey, we've like changed up these things in Storybook. We have these different live code components, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe that is a different Slack message or an email or wherever those folks are hanging out, and so on and so forth. I'll give like a quick plug here, small commercial break. I know here at Zero Height, we've been having that conversation a lot when it comes to automation and how we get the word out to folks, because we just released a Zapier integration, and have thought about, okay, like how might you automate sending an email to this person, sending this on Microsoft Teams, doing this over here so that you get the right information. We're talking about it in a webinar on May 8th around automation, not just with Zapier, but just automating lots of different things in a design system. So if you're interested in that, we'll throw it in the show notes, and kind of talk about that. But I think the big takeaway, at least for me, is that how you communicate the design system is going to change based off of the audience, because you're trying to make it important to them so that they want to adopt it, and what they care about is going to be different than the next team meeting that you go to.
For sure. Like, yeah, I think that's a very good point because you don't want to just have like a little like Slack bot that says like new update and not really much context. And then that's the only information that people ever have. Like that, like you said, that might be good for just the broader general company itself. But getting specific as to like what those changes are depending on the audience is really important. And I think that's also where it's really good to have advocates in the product teams to be able to say, hey, this change was made. And so also this is going to mean X, Y, and Z for us
Mm,
going forward. That's super helpful because it puts it in context. And I think people are willing to listen and understand and try things as long as they're informed. If they're not informed, they're just not going to know what to do. So oftentimes they will either just do what they've been doing or figure out an answer on their own, and that's kind of not what you want them to do. So yeah, the more informative you can be, like the better, because people, I think, as long as they hear the information, they'll be, I think they're more inclined to use it, for sure.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Kevin has a question that is a bit around collaboration, but I think also a bit around how we think about design systems in a broader sense. And Kevin's question is, having a long running conversation on single source of truth. What is it? Where does it live? Who is responsible for deciding what is true? Maybe there's no real answer, but a big, interesting conversation. What do you think about when you hear sort of like that discussion being brought up?
Yeah, I feel like like almost like as governance can be a dirty word, like single source of truth can be like another unspoken dirty word that people just don't like. It's very polarizing, right? Um, so I think, in terms of like when people are thinking of single source of truth, it's like think about like the life we live today of like
Hmm.
getting information everywhere from like all like before we used to get the news from like the newspaper, and then now we get it from like Instagram and TikTok, which maybe you shouldn't get your news from those places, but you can get it from like lots of different outlets, and it can be really hard to figure out where you're supposed to get information from. So that's why people are like really harping on single source of truth of like I want to know that this location, be it Slack, be it Zero Height, be it Confluence, be it Figma, like is where I get the information that is
Hmm.
actually accurate to what I need. Um, but I think the other half of that argument is that people are like, I'm not I'm a developer. I'm
Mhm.
barely using Figma. I use other code tools. I use Storybook. That's my single source of truth. And I think the single source of truth is kind of like a misnomer. Um, so I kind of like sometimes people say documentation should be your single source of truth. And I like to think of it as like a launch pad. So like you go to your
Mm.
documentation. So like when you go to Zero Height, you know that you're getting the latest and greatest because everything else is connected. Like Storybook is connected, Figma is connected. Um, Anything else that you have is connected to it. So you know that when you go to your launch pad, you're getting the right information, the most accurate. You're not having to hunt through different like Figma locations and teams and projects and files. You're not having to scroll around in, well, I'm not a developer. So like your Cody bits and like the world of whatever you do. So like I think that's the thing is like you know that you can go to your documentation as a launch pad. So that way it's not a single source of truth because like, Storybook is truthful, Figma is truthful, but you have the accurate location from your launch pad. Um, so I think that's like a mindset that I think I try to encourage from designs or with design system teams and to kind of explain that to people who consume um, their design system documentation. In terms of like who's responsible for deciding like what's true, I think that's kind of where you have that governance process of like, okay, who amongst your collaborators has that final say? Is it the manager of the design system team? If you don't have a manager, like who is next in line? Is it the design director from one team or all the design directors? And that's something that has to be discussed with your design leadership to get that answer. I think, when I was trying to align a design system, I had to have various directors from different product lines weigh in on feedback. A lot of times it was just me informing them of, hey, this is the change that we're making. But anything like a big, very obvious change, like changing the button colors, that is something that they would review because they are accountable for what's happening in the product. And oftentimes they were pretty amicable about, they're like, okay, yeah, that's fine. Cause they just want to be aware. Like I think that's also part of collaboration is like making sure there is like shared information and awareness and informing people.
I really like the analogy of documentation as a launch pad. I don't think I've heard you describe it that way, but it was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I do think that it allows us to give validity to all of these different components of a design system and to say, like, hey, we have like one place where you can find the multiple sources of truth. And I suppose source of truth because it is linking out to those things, then fine. But it does not necessarily have to have this mystical sort of like aura around it, in that like this is the only place that can ever have anything true and everything else is false.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think that's where people get really grumpy because you can't you don't use zero height to code from it. You use like you might you reference other things. So yeah, that's why I go with like Launchpad, which seems to like resonate better. And like if anyone tries that with your team, I would love to hear what happens. Let me know if tomatoes get thrown at you. I'll come to your work and then rectify the situation.
I was Are you gonna show up to get tomatoes thrown at you? Like that could go
No, I'm
really,
gonna
really
like yeah.
awry.
I'm just gonna be like, look, we have to set the record straight.
All right, fair enough. Fair enough. So we've got one last question that we'll take over from Stephen. That is about how to document a component. And do you do things like categories? What information do you add? And perhaps I'll add a little bit to Stephen's question there to keep it in the realm of collaboration. When you do decide what needs to be documented for a component, how do you share that out so that people can then give you back the right thing to then be added to the design system or wherever you might want to put it?
Yeah, I think like I think the big answer is like it depends, right? Like it depends.
Every time, at least
Um
once.
yes, exactly. So, when it comes to documenting a commit, like it's you can I think you can go to different design system sites for inspiration. I wouldn't take it as like the gospel and the rule that you have to follow.
Mm.
That's helpful. It's a good starting point, but I would talk to your, designers and engineers, whoever is going to be consuming information about the component, um, and just seeing. like, hey, what's helpful information for you to have? And that might help you understand like how much to put in and how little to put in. Because I think the other thing is like there's a tendency to over document because you're like, oh, it's the library and it's the launchpad and this is where all the usage guidelines go. Some of the stuff might not need to be mentioned. Like you might not need to add code snippets. So I think that's the thing is like getting a sense for like what people need most and also weighing it in with like the stuff information that that people are going to need because they might be like I don't need usage guidelines but that they need usage guidelines especially when that they're not following how things are supposed to be done. So um I would definitely get feedback early and often keep a draft and then once you have like a set like template-ish or an example you can get feedback that way. I know as you're putting in information you can have other people contribute as editors in Zero Height. People can also be reviewers and add feedback. So there's different ways that you can work in collaboration to make sure that you're getting like the right amount of information, the right level of information in, and that's what's most useful for people. Because while you want to document stuff, you want to make it so people can actually consume the information you have. Um, because otherwise, if it's like too much information, they're not going to want to read it. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful.
I think it is, right? And I think when we've spoken to a lot of teams, you might look at these examples of documentation from these really great design systems, and you say, okay, this person has X, Y, Z, A, B, C, therefore, that is exactly how I need to document a component. And maybe it would work in your instance, and maybe it wouldn't. But I think starting from consumers and understanding, hey, what do you need to be able to effectively use documentation? And going from there is probably a really good place to start. And then Grace also has a question here about like, would do's and don'ts live in a section alone, or should they be embedded in other sections? And I would imagine that you can even answer questions like that using the same method, or perhaps even trying it a couple different ways, right? Like maybe you make an assumption that they should be in their own separate section, and then you talk to people and they're like, wait, what? I didn't even know there were do's and don'ts at all. And then you're like, okay, well then let's try something else, right? And everybody's experience is going to be a little bit different, but you are building for the consumers that you know and that you want to serve.
Yeah, for sure. And I think some of it, what ends up happening with design systems is that we're like so focused on getting things built and things documented that we lose sight that this is actually a tool and a reference that people use. And so it could benefit from usability testing. So yeah, like Neff said, you can make a mock-up of, hey, this is like what a component looks like with do's and don'ts on the same page. And it's just one long page. And here's a section, or here's like another example of a component that has tabs for all the different things. So there's one section, one tab for do's and don'ts. And you can do some usability testing, get feedback. Maybe even as you're designing it, you're like, okay, this is a mess. Maybe it's harder to maintain this way. Or yeah, you can get feedback and say, oh, like people didn't find the tab or people didn't mind scrolling because there's a navigation in place. And so it really depends on what's helpful in that feedback. And so it's also a great way to collaborate with user researchers for help on doing some usability testing. If they can do it, great. If they can show you how to do it, awesome. It's also great and I think it's also, asking beyond just the designers that might be consuming this information, but asking other people like engineers if they needed to understand where the usage guidelines or do's and don'ts were, how would they go about it? And as part of the main users, you can even interview, do some usability testing with uh like indirect users. So maybe like brand or marketing on occasion might visit the page, get some feedback from them, but also like weigh it knowing that they're not coming to the page as frequently. So that is also a great way to understand like how best to document some of these do's and don'ts. Because I think the other thing is like you can go to a bunch of design system sites and see what they're doing, and they're doing things both ways. Um, but you don't know the why behind it. So there's no information on to like why they made this decision. You just see it. So really it's understanding like, what's most useful for your team. And I think also, making sure things are consistent. And I think there's also some level of understanding like the maintenance involved. So I long time ago was writing accessibility guidelines for each component and at the bottom of the page. And I thought I was really, really smart. And I was like, everything should be like accessible, they color contrast, blah, 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 blah. And then I was like, why am I writing this 50 times? Because then if I have to edit it, I have to edit it 50 times. So then I made like a global accessibility page of like everything is this is a general accessibility. We all follow this level of color contrast unless otherwise specified on the component page. So then in the component page, you're explaining anything that's actually specific, which then it helps with cognitive load. Like you're not boring the person by just saying the same thing over and over again. You're providing something really specific.
Yeah, that's a good perspective as well. That it's about I suppose like maybe saying like, hey, I don't want too much like debt in the design system, and want to make sure that it is something that is easy to continuously update. And if it gets too hard to update, it might mean that it falls short of being the latest and greatest, which is what we want. I think before we hopped on the call, you put a little note to me in our shared notes that I should close this out with a main takeaway for collaboration. So I don't know if this is going to fulfill what you had in mind, but I think the main takeaway from me is that you should collaborate. And I suppose awfully simplistic, but I suppose how you think about collaborating around a design system is going to matter quite a bit, based off of how you all collaborate around other projects and trying to bring in those elements around the maturity of your design system, and around the different roles of collaboration that you might have. So, Michelle, I'll throw it back on you. Now that we've talked about collaboration for almost an hour, what do you think is your main takeaway of collaboration around your design systems?
Yeah, so definitely collaborate and like yeah, like you said, like what collaboration is like will really matter. So like spending time to kind of figure that out. I think when people think collaboration, they also think like democracy and everyone gets a vote and like it's not that's not always the case, right? Like it's not always the best suited for a design system. Um and so like thinking about that, but also like governance is your friend for this process. Like it's not about setting rules and do this or else, but it's really about shepherding that process so everyone feels good about participating. And yeah, I think that's I feel like that's the yeah, takeaway in essence of like collaborate, but also, think about what that means instead of just saying everyone gets a vote, right? Because that seems fair. At surface value, sure, but there it's a lot more nuanced with design systems.
Absolutely. I'm with you there. So, thank y'all for joining us for episode 7 around collaboration in design systems. We'll be back soon to talk about something else, and we hope to see you there. In the meantime, check out some of the resources in the show notes and find us over on Zeros, our Slack channel, where Michelle and I are hanging out to answer questions, talk about things, and just about anything else. So, we'll see you then.